Counter-Narrative News wanted to share a very important extract from a book. It's basically the autobiography of leading Palestinian cultural political figure Leila Khaled, a leading figure of the radical Marxist anti-colonial Palestinian revolutionary movement, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. She made her name by the hijacking of white settler colonial Israeli-owned aircraft, passenger aircraft, in which no one was killed, although actually someone was. It was her own comrade who was killed in one of her later hijackings. But the hijackings are only important in as much as it was a historical means by which to bring the Palestinian cause to a global audience, which it did very effectively. The book by Leila Khaled is called My People Shall Live. It's been edited by George Hajar and published in 1973. Leila Khaled was born on April the 9th in 1944, but also another significant leading figure of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, was also born on April the 9th, but in 1936, and that's Hassan Kanafani, who was martyred by a attack, unfortunately a successful attack, by the military intelligence services of the white settler colonial state in Tel Aviv. And there's a quote from Hassan Kanafani, who was the editor of Al-Hadaf, which was the organ of the PFLP, and if one's not mistaken, Al-Hadaf means the target. There's a quote from him at the beginning of this book. It says, it is not enough to hate and believe in the past to make a revolution. Hatred and belief in the past are sufficient prods for the rebellion phase. We must love and be future-oriented if we wish to carry out the revolution. We will, in a subsequent episodes, share more of Hassan Kanafani's work, an incredible figure of a man and a revolutionary, an artist, a playwright, a poet, a great literary figure, and a very sophisticated revolutionary socialist anti-colonial leader of the Palestinian and wider Arab and wider Third World global cause. We'd like to share chapter 3 from My People Shall Live by Leila Khaled. To quote, Exile in Kuwait. In Kuwait and the Arab Gulf, every non-Kuwaiti is an alien, except the British, the Americans and their appendages. That's Khatib Karuni. Arab nationalism was a 19th century idea. It was first propounded by literary elements and liberal writers who came in close contact with European thought and writers at British and French universities. Students and reformers were the first to espouse the nationalist ideas and organize Arab clubs. From the outset, Arab intellectuals were in the forefront. Arab soldiers and officers in the Ottoman armies joined the intellectuals at the turn of the century, particularly after the Ottomans launched their Turkification policy in the first decade of this century. In those days, nationalists did not have a clear conception of nationalism, nor did they have a defined framework encompassing all the Arabic-speaking people. Nationalism was Eastern, not Western. That is, it included the fertile crescent states of West Asia, not North Africa. Indeed, some important figures such as Al-Afghani, who had advocated the Islamic Ba'ath, failed to distinguish between Arabism and Islam. His concept was strengthened by Western encroachments on the region and complicated by his advocacy of liberal democratic ideas within the Muslim world. Al-Afghani and his followers regarded the problems facing Islam as one of civilization and community. They thought that the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, 1798, and the subsequent takeovers of the Arab West by France and the occupation of Egypt by Britain were a repeat of the medieval wars of Islam and Christendom. To them, the answer was therefore clear. The Muslim world had to react as a community to withstand the onslaught and to defeat the West. Arab and Muslim were one. All Muslims had to act collectively. It took nearly 3 decades to jettison that mental albatross. Islam and Arabism were divorced and distinguished as 2 different concepts rather than remaining as one and indivisible. The occasion for the separation was revealing. It left the Arabs breathless, defensive, bared. They knew how to react to the Christian West and how to face the latter's challenge by holy war. Now the co-religionists, the Turks, tried to Turkify the Arabs, which they had dominated from the 16th century until World War I. The Arab response was anguished shock. They had to learn quickly that Muslims were not all brothers and that Turks were not Arabs, that the world was no longer run by religious bigots, but by capitalists, that states and parties seek alliances on the basis of mutual interest, not religious affiliations, that Arabs must alter their view of the world or remain subjugated. There was no specific party to cope with these issues, but there were individuals and groups based in Beirut, Cairo, and Damascus. There were also nationalist officers in the Ottoman army who formed a part of the Young Turks. These officers were treated contemptuously by the rest of the Young Turks after the latter disclosed their intentions in 1908 and repudiated the idea of a decentralized empire based on national autonomy. Those officers, the intellectuals and students, constituted the cadres of the Great Arab Revolution in 1916. The net result of that revolution was the proclamation of a Damascus-based Arab state in 1920. The revolution and its leaders were rapidly suppressed and dispersed. The eastern part of the Arab world was dismembered and occupied by the British and French, who divided it amongst themselves in accordance with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which allocated Lebanon and Syria to France, and Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan to Britain. The secular Arab nationalists were eliminated. The regionalists were bribed by state principalities and given kingly titles. The Hashemites and the hangers-on carried the day by becoming pliable British tools using religion and tribalism to perpetuate their power. The idea of nationalism alone survived as the Arab East was divided into spheres of influence between Britain and France. Palestine was conferred on the Zionists in the Balfour Declaration, and the Mandates regime did its utmost to realize the Zionist ideal. To infuse the idea of nationalism with socialist content required approximately half a century of turmoil and at least 3 major defeats for the prevailing feudal and petty bourgeois regimes. In each case, the Zionists triumphed while digging their own graves deeper. From 1920 to 1948, nationalists attempted to advance a secular liberal idea of nationalism. They failed dismally because both they and the feudal commercial ruling classes thought in terms of Western capitalist analysis and tried to compete for Western favors. Both were imposed practically from above, and they were never able to incorporate the masses into their system. The secular nationalists, with their liberal beliefs, had the historic value of discrediting themselves and the Wafd Party of Egypt, unwittingly convincing the Arab people that the West was their intractable enemy. In other words, the Arabs remained weak and divided, and the West was held responsible for their division and penury. It seemed, moreover, that the West never gave its clients an opportunity to develop a capitalist society in the Arab world, and the Arab rulers remained as remote from the people as their Ottoman predecessors. In this environment of weakness, Zionism was able to implant itself and deliver the coup de grace to Arab feudal mercantilism in 1948. As a result, a petty bourgeois nationalism arose and reflected itself in the first pan-Arab nationalist party, the Ba'ath, a social democratic movement. The Arab Ba'ath, formed between 1943 and 47, as opposed to the Islamic Ba'ath of yesteryear, was a significant development. It revitalized the idea of Arab nationalism and gave it a secular frame of reference. More importantly, however, the Ba'ath tied the idea of Arab unity with the concept of socialist humanism and placed socialism anew on the agenda of the Arab nation. The slogans of the Ba'ath were liberty, unity, socialism. Unfortunately for the Ba'ath, it did not inherit the mantle of the Arab Revolution because its ideologies did not take into account the contradiction between liberal democracy and socialism, because they glossed over the relationship between socialism and mass mobilization and organization, and because the leadership preferred individualistic theorizing and rulers to relevant social theory and mass work. Since Ba'ath was born an adolescent intellectual, it was unable to surmount that condition and integrate itself in the society it purported to represent. In the 60s, its military leaders became pushists and incapable of relying on the masses. The colonels depended on their fellow colonels and the civilians on their tribal associations, the intellectuals on their salon audiences. Ba'ath became only a party in name in the 1970s, not a revolutionary instrument for the transformation of Arab society. To a number of nationalists, Ba'ath lost its historical relevance in the late 1940s because Palestine was not its first priority and because it lacked understanding of revolutionary struggle and iron organization. Those nationalists attempted to replace the Ba'ath and the historic agent of Arab social change, and in 1948 they formed the Corps of Arab Martyrdom, Kataib al-Fida al-Arabi. Between 1952 and 1957, they were known as the Arab Youths, al-Shabab al-Arabi. In 1952, they called themselves the Arab Nationalist Movement, Harakat al-Qawmin al-Arab. In 1967, they effectively ceased to exist. In 1970, the Arab Work Socialist Party, Huzb al-Amal al-Ishtraki al-Arabi, succeeded the ANM as the Pan-Arab Party. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Al-Jabal Shabia Tahrir Palestine, which was formed in November 1967, replaced the Palestinian branch of the ANM, which had been set up in 1962. At the outset, the movement was a collection of sentimentalist rationalists nourished by the ideas of Satish al-Husari, a writer who stressed the idea of nationality and based it on language and history only. In 1963, the movement was in a state of flux. Revolutionary radical nationalism was posed as the new alternative. The social question was becoming the focal point. It was this prospect and the intellectual and moral challenges it entailed that I pondered then as a member. The nuclei for the ANM were organized by a group of students and graduates from the American University of Beirut in the 1940s. The most important figures were Dr. George Habash, Dr. Wadi Haddad, Hani al-Hindi, and Ahmed al-Khatib. The initial cadres were mostly Palestinians who were appalled by the Arab disaster of 1948. The creation of the Zionist state gave the movement the necessary impetus for growth. The leaders were populist, anti-imperialist, agro-nationalists. To them, nationalism and anti-imperialism were the principal preoccupation. Israel was the principal enemy. The Arab masses were the principal friend. Because of these political propositions, the young nationalists fought in the 1950s against entangling Western alliances, against the Hashemites in Jordan and Iraq, against Arab advocates of Western capitalist ideas. As the movement evolved, Nasser attained stardom in the firmament of the Third World by concluding the famous Czech arms deal with the Soviet bloc and nationalizing Suez. In recognition of these achievements, the nationalists identified themselves with Nasserism and applauded its deeds for the next decade. At the time, it was patently clear that both Nasser and the ANM were natural allies. Both believed in class collaboration and national unity. Both held ambiguous ideas regarding cooperative socialism. Both were elitist and statist in their conception of leadership and the role of the state in the economy. The only difference was that Nasser was in power and was unable to transcend his environment. The ANM was not in power, and in due course it turned against those very oligarchic ideas. Nasser was proud to react and manipulate pressures from East and West and boasted about being a pragmatist power wielder. The ANM leaders, on the other hand, were movement people. As such, they were more attuned than Nasser to the currents of modern thought and more capable of grasping and adapting to reality. In the mid-1960s, they became advocates and practitioners of armed struggle and scientific socialism. Nasser died in 1970, a soldier diplomat, not an advocate of people's wars. Meanwhile, during the period of close collaboration, contact between Nasser and the movement was maintained by such nationalist Syrian officers as Sarraj and the Egyptian political ideologue Abu al-Nur. The relationship was cordial but paternalistic. Direct contact was made for the first time on November 21st, 1961, when Hani al-Hindi, a Syrian radical member of the ANM, visited Nasser at the latter's request. Al-Hindi raised some fundamental issues with Nasser regarding the Syrian secession and the future prospects of Arab revolution. But by that time, Nasser's interest had shifted to Egyptian socialism. Dr. Habash, the Secretary General of the ANM, met Nasser on April 11th, 1964, and was favorably impressed by Nasser's formidable personality and his ability to master issues and people. The exchange was in a period of expansive dimensions, for Arab nationalism and Nasser seemed to have recovered from the agony of the Syrian divorce. Just pausing the quote. The Syrian divorce is around Syria leaving what was basically Nasser's initiative of an attempt at developing actual Arab unity, which was called the United Arab Republic, which included at different times Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. Anyway, to continue with the quote. However, the meeting took place at the point when the roads to Jerusalem began to diverge radically and openly. Therefore, it may be important to underscore the fact that the A&M not only preceded Nasser and Nasserism in terms of time, but it also never became his permanent and supple tool, nor did it stop at Nasserism. We admit that the A&M was a staunch defender and ally of Nasserism in the stage of the national revolution, and we offer no apology for it. Moreover, the parting of ways, not the break with Nasser, came over the South Yemen question in the mid-1960s. Here was a situation that Nasser tried to contain and keep under his grip. He helped organize and promote the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, FLOSSY, a group of British-oriented unionists and nationalists headed by Sanjak. The A&M, on the other hand, recognized its own South Yemen wing, the FLN, as the legitimate representative of the South Yemenis. Armed struggle commenced in the countryside and the peasants were converted to the revolution, while FLOSSY was enjoying the limelight and the glare of Cairo and negotiating compromises with the British. Finally, the British were forced out and the People's Republic of South Yemen was proclaimed in November of 1967. Within a few days, the bubble of FLOSSY was punctured and it passed from the scene. Nasserism was contracting and narrowing its horizons. The A&M revolutionism was replacing it by expanding its base and broadening its social views. In the post-June War period, A&M revolutionism became the magnet of the Arab masses, the galvanizing force of the poor, the weak, and the wretched of the Arab world. In a nutshell, the question that posed itself was, who shall govern, the colonels or the people? We in the Arab Work Socialist Party say the people. That's why we contend that the revolution is coming. That's why I became a full-time revolutionary. In the spring of 1963, Israel was 15 years old. Instead of rekindling the Arab spirit and resuming its historic mission after the breakup of the United Arab Republic, Nasserism was becoming inward-looking, repressive, managerial. Economically bourgeois, it became a spent force in historical terms. The Yemen Intervention, October 1962, and the National Charter of May 1962 notwithstanding. Statesmanship, economic progress, political stability were touted as the hallmarks of the Egyptian regime. The UAR placed advertisements in the New York Times inviting monopolistic investors to share in the profitable state enterprises. Gone were the days when Nasser spoke and Western industries came to a halt for lack of oil. Gone were the days when Nasser spinned revolutionary slogans on the Arab masses' seas and burned embassies. Gone were the days when the Western prime ministers were treated like messenger boys and scoffed at in public. Yet, in spite of this turnabout, we in the A&M remained Nasser supporters until 1967. The Nasserite social order consisted of a charter that promised a new UAR based on Islam, democracy and cooperation, recognized the dominant role of the state in the economy, acknowledged the role of the national bourgeoisie, conferred on workers and peasants half of the parliamentary seats, granted employees an advisory role in the management of their fields, factories, offices, and pledged to give them financial rewards based on profits made. Nasserism was turning Egypt into a paradise of colonels, managers, clerks. By 1965, he, with Haecelian frankness, told the Second Palestinian National Congress that he had no plan for the liberation of Palestine. Furthermore, Arab unity was revived in the spring of 1963 for about 3 months when Iraq, Egypt, and Syria agreed, April 17, to form a new and revitalized United Arab Republic. The unity talks were held in Cairo after the Baathists, the junior partners of Nasser of the 1958 United Arab Republic period, seized power in Iraq on February the 8th, and Syria, March the 8th. To bolster their regimes, the Baathists called for Arab unity and for cooperation among the progressive forces. Nasser could not ignore or oppose their call, lest he be considered an anti-unity man. After the proclamation of the new UAR, however, the Baathists returned to their capitals and began to purge the Nasserites and fully remove them from power completely. In early July, Nasser showed his displeasure by releasing the recorded tapes of the talks to Al-Ahram, the mouthpiece of the middle-class Egyptians. Mohammed Hakel, the editor, serialized censored verbatim accounts and commented scathingly on the Ba'ath, thereby signaling to the world that Nasser had no intention of proceeding with the autumn merger as scheduled. The disclosures demonstrated two facts. First, that Nasser was unwilling to regard anyone as his equal or subordinate, Egyptian national interests to the common Arab good, and secondly that the Baathists were insincere, mistrusted Nasser and viewed themselves as the successors to a dying Nasserism. In the ensuing years, Baathism too became a regime of colonels. This and other semi-fictional incidents puzzled, bewildered and confused the A&M. By the spring of 1963, I realized I would not be able to return to the American University Beirut in the autumn. I had to make a decision. There were few work prospects to explore. There were none in Lebanon. I was 19 years old and I was not looking for a husband to serve. I couldn't stay at home and vegetate. In that confusing spring, a family incident led me to seek refuge outside of Lebanon. For 15 years, my family had been exiled from our beloved homeland, that's Palestine. Since a state of war existed between the Arab states and Israel, we had not seen a single relative from Haifa or Majd al-Karum. Travel restrictions were too severe, bureaucratic red tape was overwhelming, and financial considerations were difficult to overcome. However, after prolonged and careful preparations, my father went to see his family in Jerusalem at the Medelbaum Gate. He waited for 3 days, but no one showed up. A few weeks later, a meeting was again arranged, but this time my father was paralyzed and not able to go. Mother went without him. The meeting was a nightmare of barbed wire. When grandmother saw mother, she presumed her son must have died and she collapsed. My aunts, my cousin and my mother carried on a teary dialogue for about an hour. Little or nothing was said beyond conveying greetings and fleeting reminiscences. We were all drenched with tears. We looked at each other, wondering whether reunion would ever be possible. No one could utter a coherent sentence. We parted infuriated at the Zionist overlord. As mother said adieu to grandmother, Granny placed her necklace around mother's neck and kissed her. An Israeli guard looked on and instantly pounced on mother and snatched the necklace from her chest. Mother fought back, but the man with the gun prevailed. She returned home upset by Arab inability to protect her and shocked by Zionist brutality. Such events kept my family and most Palestinians away from the Zionists. Since then, we have not seen our relatives, and father died without having seen his mother and sisters for 18 years. What was I to do in the midst of this situation? Where was I to go? I couldn't bend heaven. I would scratch hell. Kuwait was the only outlet. There was no other possibility. In the summer of 1963, the voice of the Arabs beamed broadcast from Cairo to the four corners of the globe, and the press of the Arab world was filled with the idea of the Palestinian entity. Innumerable Palestinians, including myself, were attracted to the idea, if not to the organization that was intended as the embodiment, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO was set up by the Arab League states in January 1964. The PLO was launched by the Arab League to contain the Palestinians while supposedly giving them an instrument of liberation. At the time, only a few perceptive people saw Arab summitry for what it was. Those who foresaw had no power. Arab presidents and kings met in the splendor of Cairo, and although they decided not to confront Israel, they led their people into believing that they were preparing for the eventuality of war. They issued joint military commands that had no power. Weeks later, they blamed their failure on Lebanon for allegedly not allowing Arab troops to occupy strategic positions on its soil, as if Syria and Jordan had agreed to the proposal and implemented it, and as if Lebanon had remained the only obstacle. They had allocated the astronomical sum of $13 million to divert the waters of the Jordan, yet such a sum wouldn't be enough to dig a ditch. They created the PLO as a crumb to the Palestinians, and the faithful believed in the good faith of the leadership. All was a sham, as the disasters in the June were unmistakably to show. The PLO was born crippled, if not dead, and the Arab states neither allowed the Palestinians to act independently, nor did they themselves act with sufficient vigor to safeguard Palestinian interests. The PLO consisted of the remnants of the dead social class, and its leaders were given their positions in recognition of their loyalties to the various summit conferences. The PLO was a skeleton put on display at the Arab League headquarters. It was neither a revolutionary spearheaded to lead the struggle for the liberation of Palestine, nor a rallying point for the dispersed masses of refugees. In late September 1963, I departed for Kuwait with mixed feelings and without prospect of employment. For 3 months I was without work, waiting for a reply to my application from the Kuwait Ministry of Education. At last I received word in mid-December that a position was available in Al-Jahra, some 50 kilometers from Kuwait City, the capital of Kuwaiti state, where my brother Muhammad lived. During the intervening 3 months, I thought about the world situation and pondering the meaning of life, especially after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November the 22nd. I do not know why the Kennedy assassination affected me emotionally. Kennedy was the president of a state that helped perpetuate my exile, a state that maintained and advanced the Zionist cause I hated. Kennedy was a sophisticated patrician, a class enemy, and had given key posts in his regime to at least 3 dedicated Zionist Jews. He approved the invasion of Cuba in April 1961 by a pack of American-supported mercenaries. Yet I, the hardened Palestinian revolutionary, was for some inexplicable reason cried when I heard the news. I watched the funeral on TV and saw Americans weep. Until then I had thought of the United States as a nation of monsters and scoundrels capable of perpetrating every conceivable crime. I revised my views slightly, but Lyndon Johnson's rapacity and Nixon's hypocrisy have reinforced the original image. I wept for Kennedy perhaps because I somehow identified with the youth of America that loved and admired him dearly. Perhaps I may have believed, as some Arabs did, that Kennedy was indeed going to work for the restoration of Palestinian rights, as the Kennedy-NASA correspondence later illustrated. I suspect that my tears were a natural human reaction. My prejudices couldn't stop them until it was too late. I'm not sorry I cried. Al-Jahrar, for a girl from AUB and the political mill of Beirut, was a city of eternal boredom. We were all foreigners in the eyes of the Kuwaiti Arab government, though every one of us came from the Arab world. The only colourful aspect of this school was the multitude of foreign dialects spoken. The Egyptians, Palestinians and Syrians were the largest group. This was the first time I had come into close contact with Egyptians. The Syrians were the same as the Palestinians with the exception of the lady principal, Suad, who excelled as an obsessive bureaucrat and an arbitrary woman. She was, to put it mildly, an administrator who prostrated herself before the Ministry of Education and set out to discipline her fellow teachers by a network of informers. Matters were complicated for me because I had no conception of roles or rules. I knew of no distinctions between governors and governed. I had no idea of bureaucratic memos and no notion of external authority. The only authority I had ever recognized since I left home in 1960 was that of Comrade Regional Commander. My world was turned upside down. My colleagues either delighted in my agony, resented me as proof of their cowardice, or secretly admired my rebellion. There were serfs who trembled before the knight and paid him homage. At Al-Jahrar, we could not leave campus without special permission during the week. On Thursday evenings, we could visit relatives or immediate family members and stay overnight. There were no cinemas to visit, no boyfriends to pass the time with, no British Museum to study in. Overt political activity was forbidden. We were truly family eunuchs in an Oriental despotic order. I recall distinctly the famous short sleeves episode when I opposed the authorities. The principal had threatened to expel me for appearing in short sleeves which were banned in Kuwait despite the sweltering heat. I challenged her and threatened to expose my body further. She was so infuriated, but was unable to carry out her threat. I informed her that I would help her write a memo on my scandalous behaviour to the Ministry of Education if she persisted in observing that ridiculous rule. She had to swallow her pride and wrote a memo recommending my transfer elsewhere at the end of the academic year. I exulted at the prospect, though I would regret the loss of few friends I had made at Al-Jahrar. The children at Al-Jahrar manifested the cultural deprivation of a rural and remote Bedouin people, but they were intelligent and quickly absorbed information. Our school was the only window they had to the outside world. They needed to be taught the rudiments of living in their rapidly developing community and warned about urban slavery. Instead, I was teaching them English and science, but I used every possible opportunity to propagate my political cause. The pupils were susceptible, and I responded positively. I did not reveal my association with the A&M. It would have been political suicide. The lady principal would have been delighted to invoke her powers. Instead, I injected my political virus in small doses. I related every issue to the world around us, and whenever possible to the Palestinian question. Some pupils listened attentively, others patted their goats, sheep or cows, or fed their chickens through the school windows. Their parents were not keenly aware of what was going on. They thought the teacher knew best, and they in no way interfered with my work. The world of Al-Jahrar, had its good points. It was not all unpleasantness, particularly for those not politically inclined. Spring came and found the Arab governments making noises about Israel stealing Arab waters from the Jordan River. They ostensibly made their own preparation to divert the river 10 years too late. No military attempt to stop the Israelis was made. A few minor border incidents occurred, and the Arabs thundered revenge. The farce went on for a year or so. Israel freely carried out her diversion project and expropriated almost all the waters of the Jordan River. Meanwhile, the honourable presidents and noble kings, without consulting the Palestinian people or considering the other candidates, appointed Ahmed Shukeri chairman of the PLO. Shukeri was their man. He could be relied upon to make the necessary flamboyant pronouncements to appease the Palestinian masses, without precipitating a crisis or organising the Palestinians into a fighting force. The PLO leadership was imposed from above and was accountable to the powers above, not to the Palestinian people who it sought to represent. Shukeri was touring in the Arab world and he came to Kuwait to mobilize the Palestinians and get them to participate in a constituent assembly to elect a Palestinian parliament. In Kuwait, Shukeri contacted the people he knew, the former upper class of Palestine, who now held lower echelon positions in Kuwait as engineers or managers of small business enterprises. The children of the refugees, the school teachers, the skilled, semi-skilled and manual workers were not contacted. They were merely expected to applaud the wise decisions of the Arab leaders and rubber stamp the election of their representative, chosen from the better people. Moreover, since the Palestinians in Kuwait and throughout the Arab Gulf were permitted no organic community or viable organizations, it was very difficult accurately to determine communal feelings. The situation enabled certain self-seeking, self-appointed individuals to represent the Palestinians. In spite of all these difficulties and my own misgivings, I agitated on our campus urging Palestinians to take an active part in forming branches for the PLO, but no branches were formed at Al-Jahrar because too many people were skeptical. I shared their skepticism, but I thought the PLO was better than nothing at all since the Kuwait government recognized it as the official representative of the Palestinians and agreed to let Palestinians join it as long as they remained outside the Kuwaiti political arena. My principal had received no directive to encourage such a club, and she decided the rule banning politics still applied and called me to her office to ask me to cease my activities. She argued that I was a Lebanese. I held a Lebanese passport and had nothing to do with Palestine. I listened to her monologue without interrupting. When she finished, I stood up. Woman principal, your kind of obedient, amoral, apolitical people were responsible for the loss of Palestine. Your kind of careerists have oppressed the Palestinians more effectively than the Zionists have. Your graveyard-like school has stunted the growth of intelligence. You are a part of the enemy camp. I believe if we don't overthrow your masters and your servile type, more tragedy and destruction will plague the Arab homeland. I believe you're more dangerous than the acknowledged foe. Let us suppose that I am only a Lebanese citizen. Does that nationality absolve me of my Arab obligations? Does it erase my Arab identity? Does it mean that I am not an Arab woman? Principal, I am an Arab. I'm a Palestinian. I am a Lebanese Arab who is going to proselytize the Arab cause here on your campus and everywhere. No force other than death can stop me. Act as you see fit. I shall not relent. I shall not be cowed. I shall not retreat. Good day. I walked out and slammed the door. I had made my last appearance in her office. On May the 28th, 1964, the Palestinian National Congress was opened in Jerusalem by King Hussein. Its 350 delegates represented a cross-section of the Palestinian people, with traditionalists in the majority. A number of prominent radicals were barred from the Congress by the Jordanian authorities. The Congress elected an executive committee of 7, reconfirmed Ahmed Shukeri as chairman, issued a manifesto, the National Charter, which embodied the ideology of our bankrupt ruling class, and elected all sorts of high-sounding state committees to man the apparatus of the forthcoming revolution. The PLO occupied the Palestinian seat at the Arab League headquarters in Cairo. Arab summitry continued in the autumn of 1964. Within a year, the leaders themselves had stopped believing their own lies, though their media agents continued to expound the plans in purple prose and poetic visions. In late June of 1964, I returned to Lebanon for what during the next 6 years became an annual furlough. In Lebanon, I rethreaded my way back to the underground and felt a sense of relief after the isolation of Al-Jahrar and the enervating heat of Kuwait. I observed that cracks were opening up within the citadel of the Arab nationalist movement in Beirut. However, these profound differences within the movement were frozen in the name of Arab unity, good statesmanship, and personal relations. Serious differences regarding ideology, strategy, organization, and personalities erupted again and again until a formal split was finally to take place in 5 years' time. As autumn approached, I made plans to return to Kuwait. Once again, I had to live in the barracks rather than with my brother. For a woman, living alone in Kuwait was simply unthinkable. At the Shab school, I discovered that I had been demoted from the intermediate to the elementary level of teaching. I was confined to teaching grade 2 for the next 5 years and thus deprived of my adolescent audience and the possibility of using my classroom as a political platform. Dismayed and annoyed at first, I reconciled myself quickly. There was nothing I could do to alter my teaching status. Resignation was a worse alternative since it meant being on the unemployment heap with a substantial number of other Arab workers. My pupils were an enjoyable lot. Many of them were Iranian origin. Their parents had immigrated to Kuwait in pursuit of work. The Shab school was populated with working-class children who were anxious to learn and willing to do their homework. They were tireless children who could have outraced baby camels given the opportunity. They were a delight to be with, but they were not important as political converts. Here I had the opportunity to say anything in the classroom without feeling Big Brother was watching. The problem was to learn how to communicate with 7 and 8-year-olds and to know what to expect from them. I decided it would be best not to expect anything more than the mastery of a few central Palestinian issues such as the Balfour Declaration, the partition of Palestine, the creation of Zionist Israel. At the faculty level, there was little tension and no clashes with the principal or any other colleagues. From 1968, the principal and a large number of teachers supported the Fatah. Those of us who supported the Popular Front had no difficulty coexisting with them. But though the atmosphere was conducive to dialogue and hospitable to liberal democratic ideas, I never publicly revealed my true political affiliations. I was also helped because I had learnt the rudiments of being a teacher and staved off confrontations with bossy administrators. Kuwait City was a cosmopolitan centre compared with Al-Jahrar. We were not village-bound. I visited my brother and his wife and children at weekends. At Mohammed's I kept in tenuous contact with the A&M, though the movement was prescribed and highly disorganized. We were closer to civilization here, yet worlds apart from the hustle and bustle of Beirut and its intellectual salons and fashionable streets. The people here seemed more mellow and there was no political life, even of the right-wing variety. For me it was a period of intellectual incubation and reflection, but not stagnation. There was ample time to study, think, contemplate, plan. Most of my colleagues had a hedonistic lifestyle, trying to boost their morale by conspicuously acquiring and consuming more goods. Some sent their parents a fair proportion of their salaries and led an abstemious kind of life. I was politically conscious and a chain smoker. I needed no other diversions. On January 1st, 1965, Fatah opened up a new era in modern Palestinian history. This is generally recognized as the date of the modern Palestinian Revolution. Armed struggle, long talk of the salons and the work of individuals and small groups, was now translated into action into daily forays into the homeland. The A&M, of course, had been doing reconnaissance work since 1953 and infiltrating its Fedayeen or commandos into occupied Palestine since 1955. The golden era of Fedayeen activities was in the mid-1915s when the Fedayeen used to roam the occupied territories at will. Although the Egyptian government had a role in financing and training the commandos, all missions were conducted by Palestinians who knew the cities and countryside well. Their incursions proved so formidable that Israel used them in 1956 as a pretext to ally with the British and French in the tripartite invasion of Suez. After the settlement of 1957 and the withdrawal of foreign troops from Egypt, Nasser banned guerrilla activities, and for 11 years not a single shot was exchanged across the borders with Israel. Egypt administered Gaza behind the UN shield, and the Arab states seemed to act as Israel's sentinels for the next decades, and they too discouraged guerrilla operations. In the autumn of 1964, activities were revived. The PLO proved to be no panacea. The Arab leaders gradually went back on their liberation pledges. The UAR-US relations were deteriorating, and President Johnson was threatening to cut the sales of wheat to Egypt. The Syrian Baathists felt under siege from the UAR and Iraq and encouraged activities that embarrassed Nasser. The Palestinian people were disillusioned with their Arab brethren, and all these factors led to a new vitality that surfaced in Palestinian ranks. The climate of opinion favoured doing something. The key Arab leader, Nasser, was running into difficulties with the United States, which meant he would support the resistance to bring pressure on Israel and thus improve his bargaining position with America. Nasser usually knew how to manipulate power to his advantage. Interestingly enough, Nasser did not anticipate the impending appearance of Fatah. He must have thought that the PLO would be a replica of the Fedayeen movement of the 50s. The new groups that were emerging and eclipsing the PLO were not under Arab League control. The Heroes of Return, Avenging Youth, and Fatah were a different generation of revolutionaries, autonomous groups, not the hirelings of Arab regimes. They expressed the rise of an independent Palestine and asserted the right of Palestinians to self-determination. At first, Fatah was ignored. Later, it was accused of being a Cento agent and even labelled as a right-wing Muslim Brotherhood underground. The more the crimes were attributed to Fatah, the more the Palestinians rallied behind it. The more Fatahites Hussein killed, the more Palestinians joined Fatah. The more bureaucratic and upper class the PLO became, the more appealing armed struggle became. The new movement provided a spark of hope that armed struggle was the way to salvation. As a Palestinian, I had to believe in the gun as an embodiment of my humanity and my determination to liberate myself and my fellow men. Every self-respecting Palestinian had to become a revolutionary. The news of revolutionary activity filtered slowly into Arab Kuwait either by word of mouth, still the most effective means of communication in the Arab world, or by friendly Beiruti or Syrian papers. The Iraqi, Egyptian, or Jordanian papers reserved their spaces for contemptuous remarks and accusations against the right-wing radicals who did not see it the Arif Haikal Hussein way. With the cessation of American wheat sales to the UAR in 1966, President Nasser started to look upon Fatah more favourably, particularly after Hussein blocked all PLO attempts to organise and station Palestine Liberation Army troops on Jordanian territory. As Arab leaders repudiated their summer pledges, they began to fall out amongst themselves, each blaming the other for not carrying out the resolutions. Nasser supported Fatah because he shared its objectives, not because he was suddenly converted to the cause of people's wars and armed struggle. In this context, Nasser divided the Arab world into progressives and reactionaries, proclaiming himself leader of the progressives. The Saudis, at the instigation of Washington, decided to propagate the cause of Islam against the menace of communism, and King Faisal became the leading proponent of the Islamic Pact, designed to include all Islamic states and tie them to Washington. The Yemeni civil war was concluded in the autumn of 1967 after 5 years of revolution. The Yemeni radicals were sacrificed at Khartoum, August 29th to September 1st, in the name of Arab solidarity and honour of financial subsidies to Nasser and Hussein from the oil kings. Egypt's 50,000 troops were withdrawn and the Yemen was abandoned to the winds of conservatism and counter-revolution. The Palestinian people had spent 17 years in exile, living on hopes fostered by the Arab leadership. In 1965, they decided they must liberate themselves rather than wait for God's help. Fatah began to occupy a central role in our lives despite its many defects and problems. Its supreme virtue, however, was incontestable. It was a fighting organization in a time when others only talked about the theories of war. It was created by the Palestinians to take up armed struggle. Some did. I was not yet ready. In 1965, my political interest broadened considerably, and thanks to a cowboy from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, I was forced to learn a good deal about Vietnam and Latin America. Next to the Algerians, the Vietnamese were a great source of inspiration to me. Here was a small nation in black pajamas, fighting the mightiest empire in the world and defeating it. As Johnson intensified his bombing attacks, and as his generals promised him victory if only more tons of bombs were dropped on Vietnam, I became angrier and angrier with myself for not being able to do anything to protest or undermine American savagery. The people of Vietnam stood up to the B-52 bombers, though their land was pulverized and practically every square foot of it became part of an American-made crater. Here was a people with an indomitable spirit, a people whose heroic deeds placed them among the gods. Here was a people whose unbowed humanity was a blessing to mankind. The Palestinians must learn the secrets of the Vietnamese: devotion to the cause, sacrifice to the fatherland, absolute commitment to the community, a revolutionary party with a clear conception of ideology, strategy, organization. We could do it. We had to do it, unless we wished to remain contemptible refugees. I hated the American government. I hated it more when I saw Adlai Stevenson in April of 1965 defending the invasion of the Dominican Republic. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the liberal hero of Eisenhower era brandishing the names of 57 communists who were members of Colonel Francisco Camafio's insurgent army. 20,000 US troops were dispatched to Santo Domingo to safeguard American life and property, a euphemism which provided a pretext to overthrow the revolutionary government. I almost died laughing when I heard on a BBC broadcast that the Christian Science Monitor checked on the 57 communists and found out that most were either dead, in prison, or in exile. The American troops liberated the island, a free election was held, and the good people elected a landed aristocratic government led by Mr. Balaguer. All this was done, of course, in loyal homage to liberalism, to the new frontiers, to the good society and the American dream. I understood the direct invasion of Vietnam and the Dominican Republic to be a prelude to the return of the age of gunboat diplomacy, which would soon stretch to the Middle East. I could not predict when the United States or its local power would make a move in our area. It seemed the USA was everywhere on the offensive as the Soviet leadership preached coexistence and tried to practice détente. From Brazil to Vietnam, from the Dominican Republic to Algeria, from Mali to Indonesia, from Bolivia to Greece. US fleets, air force and intelligence networks were undermining the achievements of the post-war period and arresting the tide of history. The 1960s was indeed America's decade. The 1970s shall be the decade of its dismantlement and complete undoing. The year 1966 was the year of personal mourning for me. Father died after a 4-year-long illness, and I deeply felt the loss of his gentle presence. That autumn, almost every teacher on that staff was wearing black for family losses. All of us were unhappy, and add to my personal unhappiness, the Kuwaiti government expelled my brother Mohammed for political activities, and Israel started anew its provocative policy of massive retaliation. The Zionists were aware of Nasser's weakness and decided to test Arab will by using Fatah's raids on the occupied territory as a pretext to attack Jordan. In November, the Israelis launched a murderous and punishing assault on As-Samu. The whole town was demolished, and dozens of its inhabitants were killed or injured. Arab military response was zero. The Arab Joint Command was a dead letter. The Arabs merely went to the UN and obtained another censure of Israel with America's approval. A few months later, in April 1967, Syria's alliance with Nasser was also tested. On April the 7th, the Israelis downed Syrian jet fighters while Egyptian MiGs looked on, wings folded. The audacious Israelis did not stop there. They knew more than we did. They challenged Nasser in May and he fell for their trap. In 1 week in June, the Egyptian army was slaughtered, its armor converted into scrap metal. Its supremacy in the east was shattered. All the illusions of the Arab nationalists were exploded in 2 hours and 50 minutes, the time it took the Israeli Air Force to pulverize the Egyptian Air Force on the ground on June the 5th, 1967. A whole era ended. A social class had failed to safeguard Arab interests through stupidity. Arab soldiery lost its moral credibility. Nasserism, if not Nasser, was dead. Expecting Arab victory, I refused to believe the outcome. I did believe it when Nasser offered his resignation on June the 9th, 1967. I awoke from my dream. I smashed my radio, went into a prolonged period of silence. My whole world had collapsed. It seemed every Arab had become a slave. The travel reservations that I had made to return to Palestine to celebrate the recovery of the homeland were cancelled. I had no desire to go to Beirut. I felt catatonic for a month, then I decided to go to Lebanon to find out what was happening. My brother Walid brought me up to date on the recent developments with the A&M. In the autumn, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was born. Here was the summary of events that occurred in the spring of 1967. On May the 12th, 1967, Premier Eshkol and his generals threatened to march to Damascus to topple the Ba'athist, ruling Social Democratic Party of Syria, hotheads. On May the 14th, Soviet and Egyptian intelligence reported a massing of Israeli troops on the Syrian borders. General Amer proposed a preemptive attack on the 19th anniversary of Israel. Nasser vetoed him. On May the 17th, Nasser ordered the UN emergency forces to withdraw. They did within 2 days. On May 18th and 19th, Nasser paraded his battle-dressed troops in front of the Western embassies in Cairo on the way to Sinai. On May the 22nd, 11 years after the Suez War, Nasser reoccupied Sharm el-Sheikh and declared a blockade of Israeli shipping. Nasser was calling all the shots. He dared all enemies. I was elated as the Israelis fumbled, apparently in a state of confusion and irresolution. On May the 26th, the ambassadors of the two superpowers, the Soviet and the American, visited Nasser, assuring him that if he did not start shooting, the Israelis wouldn't. The maritime nations were making noises and plans under the United States' auspices. They didn't move. Nasser seemed to be firmly in the saddle. Hussein rushed to Cairo to pay homage and sign an alliance with Nasser, hoping to cash in on the spoils of war. Nasser called the press of the world, and in one of his last speeches declared Israel, "Ahlan wa salam, welcome, we are ready, come and fight." On June 2nd, 1967, 3 days before the Israeli attack, Nasser was informed by friends that the Israelis were going to attack on the morning of June the 5th. All of us thought that the march to Haifa and Tel Aviv was at most a week's affair. As it turned out, the march to Suez was a 6-day endeavour. Meanwhile, the Israelis struck first and the UAR Eagles never took off the ground. The Air Force was turned into rubble as the pilot celebrated the birthday of the Admiral's daughter, although an alert had been on for 3 days. On June the 5th, 6th and 7th, Radio Cairo and the press announced the shooting down of hundreds of Israeli planes, the capture of cities, and Arab victory. We hailed Arab victory. On the 8th of June, silence prevailed. We knew instantly that something was wrong. At the UN, the UAR accepted a ceasefire order, and on the 9th, Nasser resigned. The UAR had capitulated. The tide was turned in favour of Israel. The dream ended. As the protagonists broadcast their war signals from Cairo, Tel Aviv and other capitals, in Kuwait we demonstrate in favour of Arab unity and one unified command. I, along with the others who had some nursing training, offered to go to the front. We were turned down. Those of us who smoked Western cigarettes suddenly threw them away. In May, the city of Kuwait truly felt like the short spring of the Arab nation. We were overwhelmed by our own illusions when we learned that even little Kuwait was dispatching forces to guard the Arab ramparts and participate in the battle of destiny. On June the 5th, the day of reckoning, all teachers went to hospitals to donate blood. For a whole month, I'd be listening to the news on the hour. Now was the final hour. Was it to be victory or defeat? It was defeat, on a scale much more catastrophic than the Israelis dared imagine. Nasser resigned. The masses restored him to power. He lived for 3 more years. The summer of 1967 was uneventful. All hope was gone. Little or nothing occurred to rebuild my confidence. I returned to Kuwait with my colleagues. Those whose families were in the West Bank came back with horrifying stories. The stories had a great impact on each one of us. Details about Zionist atrocities abounded. There were the usual stories of rape, arson, theft. There were the heart-rending accounts of people napalmed from the air, burnt to death or surviving with their whole body scarred. There was a story of a mother who cried to the wet tongue of her dying infant. The more tales I heard, the more hatred crystallized. I met a lady from Kalkalia who described to me how the border town was leveled and how other Arab towns were demolished. I listened intently to all stories. The experience shattered me. Nothing now could avenge Arab honor or liberate the occupied territories. All the diplomatic moves and maneuvers and the summits and the counter-summits and the eloquent speeches did not make one iota of difference. All the work I did for the Red Crescents and the funds I contributed and collected seemed minuscule. On November the 22nd, the UN Security Council, with Arab approval, sanctified Israel's permanent conquest of my home in Palestine. The UN conferred on Israel the right to use international waterways and the right to recognition with secure and recognized borders, in return for the settlement of the refugee problem and withdrawal to June the 4th borders. Israel insisted on total Arab capitulation. To add to my despair, on October the 9th, Che Guevara, my hero, was assassinated by the CIA-trained Bolivian Rangers. The June War shattered my existence, bared my essence. The assassination of Guevara pricked my conscience. Here was an Argentinian radical who had fought beside Fidel Castro in Cuba and helped the revolution attain power on January the 1st, 1959. His stature in the next 8 years assumed international proportions. His personality almost rivaled that of Fidel's. Che sacrificed his personal career as Minister of Industry when his views and those of Fidel clashed. Instead of making his differences with Fidel a public issue and undermining the revolution in Cuba, he decided to look for a new homeland for revolutionary action. He toured the African continent and befriended Ben Bella of Algeria, worked in the Congo against Shombe, secessionist gang and its European mercenaries. Soviet influence eased him out of the Congo. Finally, he went to Bolivia with a corps of 16 guerrillas, and for 11 months they struggled to establish a revolutionary base and topple the Briantos dictatorship. The inhospitability of the terrain, the lack of peasant response, the opposition of the American trained Rangers foredoomed the undertaking. Che nevertheless dared to stand up to America. His reward was murder on October the 9th, not by Captain Prado and Colonel Selnich, as the world was led to believe, but by Lyndon Baines Johnson and Hubert Horatio Humphrey. To me, Che's martyrdom can be justified because of his value to world revolution. His life was a form of perpetual renewal. His behaviour was exemplary. His commitment was total qualities the revolutionary movement needed to absorb. His adventurism and romanticism are necessary reminders of the unconquerable power of the human spirit in a world where the fear of America cripples millions, deactivates superpowers, and paralyzes professed revolutionaries. Che lived heroically and died heroically, yet I, a revolutionary woman, was living in tranquility in faraway Kuwait when my people needed revolutionaries and heroes of Che's caliber. I decided I must join the revolution. End of quote. So the reason Counter-Narrative News is sharing this, it's an important account of a historically pivotal moment, especially around the June 1967 war and the impact that has on the challenges of revolutionary Arab politics and movements. It's also important to share this history in these times where Arab nationalist leadership is basically, it's absent, it's not actual, it doesn't exist, as most revolutionary socialist frameworks have disappeared because their leaderships have disappeared. Pan-Africanism, even revolutionary struggles in Latin America, the capacity and the efficacy of that leadership is massively downgraded and is failing on a lot of strategic and basic challenges over there as well. So it's important in these times, with the defeat of revolutionary socialist and anti-colonial politics, to remind ourselves to remember, to relearn, to revisit the histories and the ideologies. And that's not to say that everything was perfect either in the 1960s. It was really one of the first phases of modern attempts to organize and to revolutionize and to resist and liberate. And in the experience of Arab nationalism, as is the case, for example, in the Chinese revolutionary movement as well, it's a little bit different with Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, because Ho Chi Minh travels and he really clearly and intensely interrogates and looks into and involves himself in the anti-colonial struggle of all racialized people, and particularly around white supremacy and the oppression of African heritage people in general and black people in general connected to that as well. So basically, just to make the explicit point, unless one understands a critique of European colonial white supremacy and forms a counter-response in terms of framework and struggle, arguably that it's still not really living up to its basic challenges. And that is also in part reflected in learning about the histories of revolutionary Arab nationalism as we share this piece as well. But you can see how the intensity of revolutionary leaderships and movements of the time of the 60s, they're fusing in with each other. So that cross-fertilization, and very much so in the embodiment of Malcolm X, but also others as well, it's intensely and enthusiastically in a very fast pace learning exactly about and grappling with issues of colonial nationalisms and colonial white supremacies, and all these things are interrelated with each other. So hope that was of interest to many of our audiences, and we will continue to share more in this regard. Many thanks.